Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is January 9th, 2024. I've got to remember to say 2024 now. And I am delighted to be here with Jasmine El-Gamal. Jasmine is a former Middle East advisor at the Pentagon. She served for 22 years in public and private sector organizations, and I will have a link to a longer bio so you can see all about that. She covered issues related to national security and international affairs, including as a consultant to the United Nations and the European Union. Jasmine, thank you so much for joining me. I've been dying to get you on Occupied Thoughts, so thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Lara. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Fantastic. So the conversation Jasmine is excited to have with me, which I've been asking her all about now for the past few weeks, is about escalation. Jasmine, some of you may have seen her. She's been doing a lot of news hits. She has been a commentator, mainly I think on UK news. Jasmine is based in London.
Mostly.
Talking about Israel's war on Gaza, and increasingly being asked to talk about rising concerns about regional escalation, which is very much on everyone's mind today. So let's just get right into it. So I want to start narrow, and then we can zoom out to the bigger issues. So to start off with, I want to ask you to talk about Israel's war on Gaza. And I guess to start off, I was in a meeting not that long ago with a colleague who was visiting from Oslo, and we were talking about this, and he commented that, and this is not a direct quote, but he basically said he has never seen any country squander so much international goodwill so quickly as Israel has done in this conflict. And, we're 3 months into this war now. It has become clear to most people that there is a disconnect between what Israel said its objectives were, right? That's freeing the hostages and eradicating Hamas, and its actual actions and policies. And I think more people are perhaps coming to the conclusion that there is a closer correlation between some of the statements we heard early on from Israeli politicians and officials that suggested more of an intent on displacement, ethnic cleansing, than the other objectives. So can you just briefly, or as long as you want, talk about your thoughts on this? And also for people in the audience whose knee-jerk reaction is, yes, but what else could Israel have done after October 7th? If you could offer some thoughts on that as well.
Absolutely. So I'll start with your last question first, because I think it's an important one. I think that a lot of people that I've spoken to who live in the Middle East, for example, and who've had, it kind of reminds me of 9/11. And I know that analogy has been done to death, but there are a couple of things I want to mention about it. I mean, one is, I remember when 9/11 happened and those attacks happened, how shocked Americans were and how they just felt. I mean, it was a once in a lifetime thing for many of them. For many of them, this is something that was just absolutely unthinkable, right? I mean, it wasn't, and analysts and people outside of the US were talking about it in this very objective way. Like, this is the number, like, why are you so upset? It was 3,000 people, so much more, so much worse has happened. And especially if you live in a country where you've just seen trauma and war and conflict, and you have thousands of people dying by the day for long periods of time, you would look at that and you would think, like, you changed the entire world because 3,000 plus people died. And they failed to recognize that not everybody's trauma is the same. Okay. Trauma is not an objective, comparison. You can't say by numbers, you can't say by events. A traumatic event is an event that's personal to someone that they feel traumatized by. And Americans were traumatized by 9/11. And that explained a lot of the things that happened afterwards. And similar to what you said about Israel, a lot of the goodwill that was squandered, we can come back to that later. But initially, the before Iraq, just like right after the moment, people were in shock and there was solidarity and there was this feeling of, who did this? We need to get them. We need to make sure this never happens again. Now take that to an Israeli context, and you have this previous immense trauma on the Israeli side, right? You have the Holocaust, you have still Holocaust survivors still living in Israel. And then for this to happen and that trauma to be relived, and then it's just, it's immense, and I felt it, right? I mean, you have to understand that, first of all, baseline, before we start talking about everything else. So when we look backwards and we say, well, what could Israel have done at that moment? I mean, obviously there was going to be a need to respond with some sort of big response to match the level of trauma, at least initially, to say, as the Israeli government, to say, we understand, like, this is a trauma, this is something shocking, we are, we are here to protect you, we're going to do something about this. I understand that also. But what separates leadership from ordinary people is knowing that there are emotional responses and that there are responsibilities that come with that leadership. If you are in a leadership position, that doesn't mean you don't get to feel traumatized, but it means that you have a responsibility to put those feelings aside and act in a way that keeps your people safe and that doesn't create more harm. And that is what the Israeli government failed to do, in my opinion, right? It wasn't that they were not equally traumatized, but it was that they had the responsibility to act in a way that didn't put Israelis, not to mention the rest of the region, in even more danger than they were in before October 7th. So when we talk about some of the things they could have done, I mean, we have targeted strikes, right, on Hamas leaders. They have intelligence. They could have capitalized on the goodwill that they had after October 7th. Everybody was shocked. And they could have gone to allies. They have relationships in the region now. Jordan, Egypt, long-standing relationships, long-standing security cooperation and intelligence cooperation. They had these newfound relationships post-Abraham Accord with countries that have equally impressive intelligence capabilities, like the UAE. And so they could have really gotten these countries together to try to figure out a long-lasting and a sustainable response. At that moment, everybody was in agreement that Hamas had overstepped and that they had to be punished, if not completely eradicated, right? And they could have taken advantage of that to create a coalition that went in and did that in a way that was as humane as can be, because of course it was never going to be 100% casualty free when it comes to civilian casualties. But there's a very large gulf between what they could have done and what they've been doing.
Yeah, I think that's very much along my thinking as well. And I would say that for folks who look at this and say, well, you have to eradicate Hamas, there is the challenge, and I think you've talked about this in the interviews about trying to eradicate an ideology versus an organization. And again, if you look at what could have been done in terms of being much more clear in holding Hamas accountable and much more clear in supporting Palestinian people and ending occupation, challenging the policies that fuel Hamas, the policies that lead to Hamas having popular support. So in parallel, those two tracks of engagement, which are very different than what we saw.
And by
Across
the
the
way,
board.
actually, there was a poll, I know you're familiar with this poll, that was done by the Arab Barometer that was actually released, I think, on October 6th, that showed that a large portion of people actually didn't support Hamas, right?
Yep.
And so that's something else that Israel could have capitalized on. If anything, people were not happy with Hamas the day before October 7th. But here we are 3 months later, and Palestinians are just being, I mean, I said the word exterminated today. I can't think of another way to describe what we've been seeing on the news. You have this happening, and it's seemingly the entire world, all of these countries that speak about human rights and responsibility to protect, and talking about, with when Russia had invaded Ukraine and how the whole world kind of stood together. We must fight against Russian aggression. Russia bombed hospitals. We cannot let this stand. And to see the response be so different in Gaza, as if their lives genuinely, literally meant less. How do you expect some people not to then say, well, at least Hamas is doing what no one else will do, which is confront this apparatus, this military, this country that's literally destroying us as a people.
So I want to put a pin in the some of what you just said, because we're going to come back to this the sort of double standard, the international law piece of it. I want to zoom out a bit, not yet to the region, and talk about what is already an escalation. So from the start of the war on Gaza, there have been these questions about how it might expand. And I think some people who watch this closely understand that even from the very beginning, it had already expanded, right? We were seeing a significant escalation of both Israeli army and Israeli settler activity. And Israeli settlers are effectively an arm of the Israeli government in the West Bank. We saw some stuff happening inside Israel itself against Palestinian citizens of Israel. And then we saw at least one very early strike in Lebanon that killed 2 Lebanese journalists. There's been more of that. So can you talk about that early, what was the right from the outset, what looked like the beginning of an expansion? And then I'm going to ask you to talk about Hezbollah and stuff later.
Right. Well, if we're talking about do you want to talk about the West Bank a little bit in terms of that level of violence?
The West Bank piece of it, and in the early days, I think a lot of people still don't remember or don't understand that. I think it was in the first 2 weeks of the war. I think it was that early on when Israel killed the 2 journalists in South Lebanon who were reporting inside Lebanese sovereign
Right, I
territory.
remember
So
that.
those early days. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think from the beginning, it was clear what the Israeli government wanted to do, and that in the beginning, what wasn't quite clear was, are they deliberately inviting a wider conflict, or are they taking this opportunity to try to deter a wider conflict? Right? Because sometimes those actions can look the same but mean different things.
And you're talking
So
about Lebanon there, not the West Bank.
I'm talking about Lebanon, right? So when there's been this tit for tat going on between Israel and Hezbollah, and tensions have been really high on and off since 2006. I mean, you remember the war in 2006 was actually devastating for both parties, and surprisingly devastating for Israel. Israel was not expecting that level of response and sort of endurance from Hezbollah. And so both parties since 2006 have been preparing themselves for the next war. Hezbollah replenishing its supplies, and Israel retraining its military, kind of, putting itself in a position where they're like, we cannot underestimate this enemy. We're going to have to prepare for the next war. It's going to be a big one. And back then, the Israeli government at the time said, we are not, next time this happens, we are not going to differentiate between Hezbollah as an organization and the Lebanese government, which presumably they did the first time around. They didn't go in and carpet bomb Beirut, for example. I mean, there was a level of separation between the two. And they explicitly stated, the next time this happens, all bets are off. You're taking responsibility as a country. So that's an important point to keep in mind, because as everyone knows, Lebanon and the Lebanese have been through so much in the last 3 years. I mean, the port blast, economic crises, political crises. I mean, the Lebanese people are exhausted. They're also traumatized. You'll notice the word trauma come up a lot whenever I talk about this region, because I think it's an underreported point, but I also think it's important to acknowledge just how much trauma this region is carrying, especially certain countries in the region. And so Hezbollah is very aware of that, and it's very aware that a war with Israel, especially a war that it chooses, that it starts, is not going to be well received, and that there would probably be a massive turn against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they don't want that. They've never wanted that. So they've both been kind of doing what they think they need to do to deter the other from starting a war, but also to remind the other, hey, if you do start this war, it's going to be really, really costly. And so in the beginning, when the journalists were killed, when these sort of cross-border attacks were happening, when Israel was mobilizing people to go to their border with Lebanon, it was unclear whether it was a deterrent stance or whether it was preparing for war. Now, we can look to where we are now, and probably it's becoming clearer But that's sort of the picture. That was the picture back then. I mean, very quickly, very early on, as you said, there was an escalation in movement, there was an escalation in rhetoric, and of course, there was this tragic loss of life of journalists, which has been a pattern that has been continuing, obviously, and tragically in Gaza. And with the West Bank, I pulled up, I wanted to read these statistics that I read in an article, an op-ed. I think David Ignatius wrote this. Basically, he was saying in this op-ed that for peace to actually happen, we're going to have to confront some hard realities on the ground. And he says settler violence has surged since Hamas's October 7th terrorist assault, which killed approximately 1,200 Israelis. Since then, there have been 343 settler attacks against Palestinians. At least 143 Palestinian households with 1,026 people, including 396 children, have been displaced by violence. Settlers have killed 8 Palestinians and injured 85, the UN said. Now, this article was written a few weeks ago. This is not taking into account what happens now. So as people have been focused on what's happening in Gaza, this has been happening in the West Bank, and it's not getting enough media. It's getting some media attention, but the level to which this demonstrates how unserious Israel is, or at the very least, Netanyahu's government is about peace, about an actual Palestinian state. You have to look at both what's happening in the West Bank as well as what's happening in Gaza, because the settler activity, the outposts, all of that stuff is very deliberately happening to precisely prevent a contiguous, self-sufficient Palestinian state.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's worth reminding people that before October 7th, 2023 was already on track to be a year of historic levels of Palestinians being killed in the West Bank and of settler violence. So even before October 7th, and then there's been this surge after October 7th. So I want to come back to Hezbollah in a second and where things are today, because the escalation in the past few days has been notable. I first want to ask you about the Houthis, because
Right.
it's a fascinating kind of, I think for a lot of people following this in the media, I mean, some of the visuals of, the pirates taking a cargo ship, and I mean, some of the videos from that first cargo ship that was taken looked like video game footage. They didn't look real. But this is something very real. We now have the US and other countries putting out an incredibly strong statement, much stronger than they've put out about anything Israel is doing to Palestinians, but putting down a line in the sand about, we will not permit shipping in the Red Sea to be obstructed by terrorism. I want you to talk to me about what the Houthis are doing. This is the Houthis coming out of Yemen, and what their game is. I mean, is this about the Palestinians? Is this about Iran, which I think a lot of people in Washington would say? Tell us what we need to know.
Right. Well, you're right. I mean, some of the images coming out, it's just, just sort of you're like, what is happening? Where did these people come from? What are they doing? So the Houthis, obviously in Yemen, have been attacking ships that are traversing the Red Sea on their way to Israel, and they're using the Palestinian cause and what's happening in Gaza to justify what's happening. It's obviously a huge threat to maritime security. It's a huge threat to trade. You have some companies that are refusing to operate and pausing operations in the Red Sea. You have others that are going all the way around the Cape of Good Hope. And the costs obviously are massively higher because they have to go around a much longer way. And those costs eventually are going to be passed to the consumer. So it's something that affects almost everyone when you come to think of it. So that's why the US and many other countries, I believe it was 13 other countries, along with the US, that recently released a statement with very strong language, basically telling the Houthis, we will not hesitate to take action, if you don't stop this. Because shipping and maritime security is a big deal for them. Now, it's not, to be transparent, I'm not an expert on the Houthis, and I'm not an expert on Yemen. I'm just following the situation as it relates to, I always want to clarify what I'm an expert in and what I'm not. So when you want to look at it in the question is this Iran? Is this Iran unleashing its proxies all over the region because it feels like this is a huge moment of weakness for Israel. And if we just, get them from all sides, hit them from all sides, that we can finally weaken them. When it comes to Iran, when it comes to Hezbollah, when it comes to, Hamas is a bit different, I would say. Well, when it comes to Iran in particular, there are those who would argue that Iran as well is not interested in an all-out war. I find it difficult to believe that it's interested in a straight up hot war with Israel, knowing that the United States would be involved. That's not something that's in its interest. But it's more of this very slow bleeding out of very slowly weakening Israel, weakening it militarily, weakening it on the international stage. I mean, it's a very slow burn, and they believe that they will eventually weaken it to the point where they have an advantage. I don't know what comes after in their mind, but it's that slowness that I think drives Iranian policy, and in the way that their proxies are being mobilized, if I can use that word. Now, if you listen to Hezbollah's Secretary General the other day, Hassan Nasrallah, he made this big speech, and it was very interesting to hear what he said. And he made a deliberate point to say, Iran doesn't control us. We're not all following orders from Iran. This is a regional resistance movement, but each resistance movement in each separate country will operate according to its own local interests, albeit within this overall umbrella of general resistance against Israel and support for the Palestinians. And it wasn't, I think he was saying that it wasn't, he's very deliberate. He would never say something that wasn't very explicit and very deliberate. He wanted to relay a message that Iran is not necessarily calling all the shots. He wants to relay this message. He's trying to put some distance between what Iran is doing, what the Houthis are doing, and so on, but also making it clear that these organizations are all tied. He mentioned the Iranian-backed groups in Syria and Iraq, and the attacks they've been conducting against U.S. personnel and U.S. Interests in Syria and Iraq. And so, he mentioned the Houthis. Of course, Hamas is in an existential war with Israel right now. And then you have Hezbollah. And he mentioned all of them. And he said, we're all operating under this banner of resistance, but we're all doing what is good for us.
So I want to actually, that's exactly the right place to end up on that question, because I want to talk more about Lebanon and Nasrallah and that speech, and really the question of further escalation. Because when we talked about this earlier, we talked about the very beginning of this war, right? You saw the tit for tat on the northern border, which I think a lot of people really saw as a tit for tat from Israel saying, don't get involved, we don't want to expand. And Hezbollah saying, we're going to respond at the level which says we're responding to this tit for tat, but we're not escalating.
Right.
That seems to have changed, though, in recent days. We've seen an escalation of Israel's activities in Lebanon, not to mention also in Syria. I think for me, most notably, for my own understanding of what an escalation would be, was the assassination of a Hamas leader in Beirut, which for Hezbollah, acting in Beirut versus acting in South Lebanon feels to me like a tangible escalation in terms of the sovereignty of the state of Lebanon. We've seen the targeting of Iranian assets in Syria. It feels to me like what we're seeing is it feels like a demonstration that Israel does want to provoke escalation. And I'd be very happy for you to tell me I'm wrong. It really does feel like that. And my own analysis is that, and this is, I'm speaking for myself here, is that there are elements in Israel that ideologically want, and others who tactically believe they need a broader escalation, because this is about resetting borders in the region. And this is the way that they're not going to have to deal with accountability for displacing 2 million Palestinians, or maybe leaving them out of Gaza altogether, because in the fog of a regional war, which leads to a change in borders in various places, It'll be like 48. At the end of it, you have a new status quo, and political realities will have to accommodate a new geopolitical status quo. So that's my somewhat apocalyptic analysis. What do you think?
I wish I could tell you that I wasn't really worried about that scenario. I mean, but not necessarily because I believe that one of the parties is going to make a very deliberate decision to ignite this explosive war that's going to happen in the region. I worry about miscalculation. I worry when, when you talk about that red line, when we talk about red lines, I worry that those red lines are not clear enough, that if one of the parties is conducting an operation, that they know that they are breaking a red line. It's, again, I'll go back to 2006 when the Hezbollah Israel war started. It started ostensibly because Hezbollah kidnapped Israeli soldiers and brought them over the border. That wasn't the first time that they had done that, right? They didn't expect that that would be the spark that set off a war. And that's what I worry about now. I worry about this spark that is not necessarily going to be one that is deliberate, but will nevertheless blow up the region. Now, Nasrallah, in his speech, he did say it was after the assassination of Saleh Haruri, of the Hamas leader in Beirut, which was kind of a slap in the face to Hezbollah, given that it happened in, quote unquote, in their neighborhood, right? But you can't say that it was completely out of left field. I mean, in fact, if anything, people who have been saying Israel shouldn't be doing what it's doing now, it should be doing more things like targeted assassinations all around the world. So it's not really unexpected that a senior Hamas leader would be killed, whether it's in southern Lebanon or Turkey, or wherever they may be. And in that sense, that probably gave Nasrallah a little bit of an out, in the sense that this was not something unexpected. A lot of people would say this was not something that was unprovoked. And so the fact that they did it in southern Lebanon was not ideal for Hezbollah, but Hezbollah could go out, say some strong words, say we're very upset, we are going to retaliate, but not feel the need to save face in a way or start a war in a way that they didn't want to. Right after he said we are going to retaliate, Nasrallah also said, but if you come after us in Lebanon, we will not stop. We will, we're not afraid of war, and we
So,
will not stop.
so how does that, I mean, we know that I think it was yesterday that Israel assassinated a senior Hezbollah leader in South Lebanon. I mean, this is why I say, like, it really almost feels like there's an egging on element here.
Exactly.
Because
Because right
I was
after
struck by the
Nasrallah,
timing.
right. So because right after Nasrallah says, he's almost letting them off the hook, like, okay, like we'll retaliate, but don't come after us. And then a few days later, they go after them. So it definitely seems like a provocation. And I just think that the stakes are so high right now that any of these parties in the region, I'm not talking about Israel, because I agree with you that there are some within Israel that are pushing for a war. But I think that these parties that we're talking about, these quote unquote resistance parties in the region, will think twice before entering a war, because remember, if you think about it, I mean, we have to remember that the difference between these two sides is that if there is an all-out regional war, the US is going to come in on the side of one party, not the others. And that makes a huge difference, of course.
Well,
It
and,
probably emboldens the Israelis, and it deters these other parties in a sense, until it doesn't, right?
yeah, I mean, the two things that when I think about this, I think about the fact that the Israeli military doctrine, which existed before October 7th, but has really been sharpened after October 7th, which is, we are the absolute enraged, crazy actor. We will do whatever we want and whatever we can, and no one will stop us and no one will hold us accountable. When you talk about them saying in the last war that next time we won't differentiate, and we think about the failure to differentiate between civilians and Hezbollah in South Lebanon over the years, and the incredible damage to civilian infrastructure and civilian deaths we've seen in previous wars, and the airport and all that, and you have Israelis basically saying, "You saw what we did to Gaza, we'll do that to Beirut."
Yeah.
So that sort of hangs over it. But the other piece is what I think sort of what you're alluding to is the miscalculation, which can even be, at the point where, Hezbollah shoots a tit for tat rocket and it actually kills an Israeli. I mean, you just don't know what's going to trigger
Don't
that.
know.
I worry that there are those who are looking for that opportunity on the Israeli side, but that's just the stuff that keeps me up at night. Um, sorry. All right, I have another question. So let's see, how to ask this. So what Israel is doing in Gaza and beyond at this point, it fundamentally depends on the international world letting them, right? The international community. It's international support and impunity, first and foremost, from the United States. This is impunity in terms of the US providing weapons, providing funding, providing moral support, providing diplomatic cover, all of that stuff. So in this context, I want you to talk as someone who served at a very, senior level in the administration, and about these things. Talk about the Biden administration. Based on your experience, how, what, how do you think the Biden administration is thinking about this? The choices that it has in front of itself right now? I mean, Israel is always a problematic policy question, anything involving Israel. But how do you think this administration understands its policy, what its goals are, what the objectives are when it talks about no daylight and bear hugs? We keep hearing the term bear hug. And how does this policy serve or fail to serve what one might objectively say are US interests, national security interests in the region and in the world, including with respect to the risk of a possible escalation to a war with Iran that Israel seems to want?
Wow. How to answer
All right,
that
I
one.
asked long questions. Take any piece of that you like.
Okay, so I was a Middle East advisor at the Pentagon in the Middle East office. I covered many portfolios. I was there during the Arab Spring, when a lot of conversations were happening around U.S. interests in the region and partnerships and leverage. The word leverage was used a lot around the Arab Spring. I was in many, many meetings with the Secretary of Defense and the top leadership of the Pentagon when we were talking about some of these really tough issues. And so this idea of unwavering US support for Israel, I know that it is hard for some people to imagine that the US could be tough with Israel behind the scenes, given how unwavering its support is for Israel in public. But I can attest to the fact that it is true, the conversations behind closed doors are tough. And it is true that Netanyahu, I can't think of one person in the US government, past or present, that actually enjoys dealing with him or likes him. But at the end of the day, none of that stuff really matters, right? What matters is what results are we seeing? It doesn't matter how many. I remember when we were working, during the Arab Spring, when the Pentagon would release the number of phone calls that then Secretary of Defense Hagel was having with then Minister of Defense Sisi in Egypt, as a way to demonstrate how tough we were being with the Egyptians, as if the number of phone calls were that's it. In and of itself, we had 10 phone calls. That means that we're being, well, what's happening as a result of those phone calls?
Yes, give us credit for process, not for results.
I mean, yeah, you've been in DC long enough. You know how important the process is. So when we look at the actual results, though, of what is happening, so ostensibly this bear hug strategy, which is basically, it means that the U.S. hugs Israel really tightly in public, no daylight between them, so as not to give Israel's enemies any room to think that there's space that they could take advantage of between the US and Israel, partly because of domestic political considerations. I mean, more than anyone, you've worked in this field for so long. US support for Israel traditionally is a bipartisan topic. It's not a controversial topic in the US. So there are many reasons for the no daylight strategy, but ostensibly that was always meant to be at least partly so that they could have really tough conversations, because the reasoning is you're much more likely to take tough criticism and advice from a friend than you would from a foe or from someone who's criticizing you in public. Well, that's a great strategy on paper, but if they're not taking advice from friends or foes, then isn't it maybe time to shift that strategy? And isn't it maybe time to start thinking about how this is affecting the region, how this is affecting US interests? And as I keep saying again and again, Israeli interests as well, because if it is in if Israel's objectives are to maintain long-term peace and security in the region, setting the region on fire and creating enemies far and wide when you're a tiny country in the middle of, this sea of enemies that you're going to create. I fail to see how that makes Israel safer in the long run. And I fault the US government for not being tougher with Israel, for not doing more to say, if this isn't helping you and if you're not going to do anything about it, we're going to do some stuff that you may not like, but trust me, we're doing it for you, and we're also doing it for everyone else in the region whose lives you're upending.
Yeah, I mean, I just two thoughts I would add on that. The first one is I think it's worth reminding people that the no daylight strategy has not always been US policy. No daylight really came in with President Obama. If you go back to, and I did my analysis, you may recall, of US votes at the UN Security Council when everyone
Mhm.
was saying that Obama couldn't possibly vote no or abstain. It would be a historic betrayal of Israel. And it's like, yeah, no, every president before Obama opposed Israel, usually multiple times at the UN Security Council. It wasn't until Obama came in that a new narrative, an incredibly resilient narrative, was created that is ahistorical, which says that no one ever criticizes Israel. Every other administration, you can go back, to pretty every administration before Obama and even Bush, Bush the son. That's the first thing. The second thing, and
And
you
can I
talked,
just say something on that, Lara, real
yeah,
quick? Because I think that's right. And if someone were to say, well, why did this start under Obama? I mean, what was Obama thinking? It's also important to remind people that Obama was a non-proliferation president, and one of his biggest goals was to have a deal with Iran that would reduce Iran's nuclear arsenal. And of course, to Israel, that was just, I mean, how could you? You're putting us at risk. How could you do this? And so I think President Obama felt the need to even more, sort of outwardly, inwardly, in all the ways, very, very supportive of Israel, to let it be known that this deal, these negotiations with Iran, what he was doing with Iran, was not going to come at the expense of Israel. So I think that also played a
absolutely.
role.
Absolutely. I mean, President Obama came under a level of scrutiny and criticism and really, I mean, slander related to what people thought his views were on Israel. It just, the history at some point will report on that, I think, and it was horrible to live through. But the other piece that I'm thinking of, as you talk about not serving Israel's interests, I think one of the challenges or one of the frustrations that I think a lot of us who work on this policy have had over the years is another disconnect, which is the disconnect between how US policy behaves as if Israel is saying these are our interests, and how Israel behaves in terms of demonstrating what its actual interests and objectives are. And that
Mhm.
speaks to Israel's long-term objectives vis-a-vis the West Bank, vis-a-vis regional ties, and the whole, I would say at this point, farce around the two-state solution, where you talk about, more than a decade of talking about wanting a two-state solution, which the US chose to focus all of its energies on. Whether they're talking about this, we're still saying we're committed to this, and we're going to ignore. My mom says, listen to what they say, but watch their feet. Their feet are walking in a very different direction. And US
Right.
policy, because it didn't want to engage oppositionally with what Israel was doing, focused on what was being said and not on the feet, which is actually a really good segue back to Gaza, where we have a rare moment of correlation between what, for the most part, Israeli officials across the board have been saying since early on and what the policy is. And that's a policy that looks a lot like ethnic cleansing and extermination. And indeed, later this week, the International Court of Justice, I keep saying the International Criminal Court, it's important to make the distinction, it's not the same. International Court
Right.
of Justice is getting set to have a sort of preliminary hearing on a South African petition accusing Israel of engaging in genocide or permitting incipient genocide, I think is this legal terminology. So I want you to talk a little bit about that. And we know the Biden administration is already doubling down in defense of Israel, saying that the South African case is not has no basis in fact, I believe was the statement that was used, which was kind of weird because it's like a very, very long document, which is
Right.
90% of it is facts and 10% is argumentation. But a lot of those facts are just statements being made by all these officials basically saying, yes, our goal here is to take all or most of Gaza and get the people out of it. I want you to talk about what all of this means with respect to something you mentioned earlier, which is international law, human rights, battle against racism and dehumanization, all these things that we refer to as the post-World War II rules-based international world order. Can you talk about what this means going forward and how it looks if you are perhaps not the most liberal leader someplace else in the region or the world, seeing Israel basically demanding impunity for doing all these things, or if you're maybe a citizen of another country who has an affiliation or an affinity for Palestinians when you see that Palestinian lives maybe don't matter. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's been really tough to watch. I mean, I have to be honest, even today watching Secretary Blinken's press conferences, things that he's been saying throughout his trip to the region. I mean, this has now been his fourth trip to the region. I think his fifth to Israel, if I'm correct, if I'm counting correctly. And to sort of see the the statements that are coming out of Blinken, of the State Department, how they have become farther and farther removed from reality over the last 3 months. The statements have stayed fairly the same, pretty much the same. Civilian, well, not in the first few weeks. Eventually, they started talking about civilian casualties and the need to for Israel to conduct itself within international humanitarian law. They talked, of course, we've
Usually
all
with verbs like should and not
should,
must.
right. Um, in fact, someone flagged something that I almost didn't catch initially, was that Secretary Blinken today said, as opposed to saying, Israel has the right to defend itself, he said something like Israel has the right to prevent another October 7th. And you can read into that what you like and why he chose to say those
Preventive
words.
self-defense. That's going to be one of the arguments Israel uses to defend itself in
Right.
the South African case.
Because self-defense is fairly clear, but like preventing another October 7th, I mean, it's a bit more vague, let's just say. So it's been hard to watch these statements because you have this trip that Biden is going on. He's talking to all of the regional leaders, and then he goes to Israel to sort of present, to brief them on his discussions in the region, and then to talk about a way forward. And at the same time, you just flip the channel, you go to Al Jazeera, you go to any of the Arabic channels that are showing things that the US or international media isn't showing, and it's shocking. The level of dissonance, the level of just like, am I watching two completely different worlds right now? So I say that not just to lament, the fact, but also um to answer your point about US credibility, about, when the US goes out and talks about what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and saying, talking about crimes that are being committed in Ukraine. I remember at some point the US was saying, well, the Putin is saying that there's no such thing as a Ukrainian. And that was like a really big thing for the US administration. That proves that he wants to get rid of them all, and that, these are crimes against humanity. look at what's happening now. How is that different? And that's what people are asking. How is that different? Is it actually just different because it is happening where it is? Is it because it's a Muslim population? Is it because it's the Middle East where you expect these things, you know, where not you, but people, some people expect, say, oh, that's what happens over there, ancient hatreds. You know, I mean, when you have an expectation of a certain people to act in a certain way, does that change how you view them in the context of international human rights law, international law? Is international law something that is just, as King Abdullah of Jordan said, is it just for some people, for some nations, for some religions? And when you look at the way the US is acting, when you look at the way Germany, I mean, you can name the majority of these, really the UK, where I live in London now, and you look at the way that they're reacting to what is clearly the extermination of an entire people. And you start to ask yourself, well, does this just not apply to them? Because if this were happening anywhere else, I was thinking today about this, about the International Court of Justice case, and again, someone was saying, I was reading this online, that the mainstream media was not going to be covering the preliminary hearings. And I just remember thinking, wow, if this was any other nation, if this were any other case and the word genocide was mentioned and there was going to be televised hearings about it at the International Court of Justice, would the BBC and CNN and other channels be covering it? So that's what a lot of people, I mean, people who are going out protesting, people who are standing up in solidarity of Palestinians, you know, there, and this bothers me. It's like when some people make this about religion, you know, this is anti-Semitic, or this is about Jews, this is about Jewish people. It takes away from something really important to people who are protesting. I'm not saying all protesters are, but we're not going to go into the nuances of people. Of course, when there are millions of people protesting, there's going to be bad people protesting things. But overall, people are just devastated. They are traumatized by what they are seeing as in front of them, by the images that they're seeing in front of them. And it's almost even more so when you think that the US should, you know, normally the US would be out there talking about human rights, talking about the, you know, and none of this is happening. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why do the Palestinians matter less? Why is this not shocking everybody? And I think that, you know, I don't say these words lightly. You know, when I say this, that racism has an element to play here. When I say that dehumanization has an element to play here, when you literally look at someone and you see them as less than human, or at the very least, you see them as more prone to that kind of violence. It's like, well, that's just what you do. So it's almost like, you know, this way you guys, like, it's not the same as us when this happens to us, because this doesn't happen to us. This doesn't happen here. I don't know if you remember this. I'm sure you remember this, but in Ukraine, when there were Ukrainian refugees coming into you know, going into neighboring countries, and there were all of these reports, just journalists saying things like, but this, you know, these refugees, they're blonde, they have blue eyes, like this doesn't happen to Europeans, you know. And it's saying that quiet part out loud. This doesn't happen to Europeans, this doesn't happen to Americans, but of course it happens to people in the Middle East. So
Yeah, I agree. I think the question of the racism and dehumanization is profound here, and I look at just the difference in how people are dealing with journalists. The number of
yeah,
Palestinian
yeah,
journalists who've been killed. You know, you think of the absolute absolutely correct celebration of lives and the courage of Ukrainian journalists being targeted by Russia. And it's a tiny percentage compared to the number of Palestinian journalists who are being targeted and being killed in Gaza. And even the journalist community is not really coming out in any serious kind of support. It's just striking, let alone, universities defending academia or the medical community defending, health professionals, all of whom are being targeted. It's been incredibly uh, just it's shattering in many ways. I want to end, and this is the last question, and this is sort of I don't want to give you, I don't want to like throw a gotcha question at the end, but this is the one that I want answered, which is if something could change today, and thinking as someone who's been inside policymaking, what would it look like? I mean, you can't undo 3 months of bad policy and probably between 28 and 30,000 dead Palestinians. It's horrific. That's not going to be you can't roll that back. But looking forward, is there a policy that does not continue down the road towards more Palestinian deaths and potentially wider escalation, policy from the US, and what would that look like?
You know, honestly, it's just hard to answer that question because if where we are now has not resulted in a shift in policy and has not resulted in things that like conditionality on aid to Israel, on I mean, what could, right? And so, I mean, your question, it's a good question, but I almost feel like it's kind of an impossible one to answer because it sounds like a fairy tale. Like, oh, if I could have anything in the world, what could I have? It's I would like to see the US use some of its leverage with Israel in a way that shows it that it's serious about what it's saying. The US is sounding more and more um, impotent, toothless, hypocritical. I mean, all of these things are going to come back to bite the US. I mean, we're talking now about entire communities in the US not wanting to vote for President Biden in the next election, right? I mean, these things, I know that there are analysts out there and there are people out there, many of them are European and American, to be fair, who are seeing this from the European perspective, the Western perspective, the where the metrics that they're looking at are things like, is the US still able to conduct trade deals? Is the US able to do X on the international stage? And that's what they're looking at in terms of measuring US credibility. They're not thinking about it, of course, in the way that you mentioned earlier, which is any country that is, what was the word you said, less than liberal, a leader that is less than liberal. Now, when they want to act in certain ways in their country and the US steps up and says, well, actually, you can't do that. That's against international law, or you're killing too many civilians. Who's going to listen? What leg do we have to, does the US have to stand on when it talks to people? So you can look at US credibility in different ways. It depends on your perspective. But when it comes to things like respect for civilian life, respect for international law, these are serious things. And these are things that have been great. These are concepts that have been greatly damaged and degraded by this unconditional support that the US has had for Israel, the level of destruction, the level of trauma. I mean, you talk about these journalists, you talk about people's lives are never going to be the same after this. This is generational trauma that we're talking about now. And you have people talking, when you look at people in charge, sometimes I think about this. I don't know why this thought comes to me, but I think a lot about this from a human perspective, right? This war is over. This administration is gone. This British government is gone. Labor comes in. All of these people who are in decision-making places, their lives go on after this. They're going to get great jobs, book deals, law firms, consulting firms. They're going to make lots of money. They're going to write books about what they should have done when they were in government, right? But for millions of people, their lives and their children's lives and their grandchildren's lives are never going to be the same again. And I keep coming back to that, because if that's not a responsibility in itself to be more, to be more, what's the word, strict, to be more tough with Israel, to try to stop what's happening, even though what's happened has already been extremely painful and extremely traumatic. But if those generations of traumatized people and homeless people, we're talking now in Palestine, people who are going to lose their homes, never to go back again, people who will just lose faith in humanity, if that's not reason enough to do the right thing, well, there are many other reasons.
Yeah, I
That
mean,
should be one of them.
it's when you're talking about, I'm also thinking about the generation of children who've lost one or more parent, generation of children who've lost one or more limbs. I mean, this is the traumas here are going to be they're just they're so profound. It really is apocalyptic in many ways. I
Yes.
feel like, when I've been asked the question, what should the Biden administration do now if they're going to try to, like, get on a better course, and I don't have an answer. I mean, I was on a call today talking about what's the International Court of Justice case, and part of the analysis of people around that case is the U.S. has to oppose it, because if they don't oppose it, they could be held accountable under the Genocide Convention as a party to the genocide for not stopping it, for enabling it by not engaging, by continuing to provide weapons. There's a certain amount of kind of in for a penny, in for a pound, or we're so invested in this, we can't let go. Or, I was thinking of the tiger by the tail, you don't dare let go, because you've got it. But, at this point, I listen sometimes to Secretary Blinken, and I try to read between the lines of what he's saying. And what it almost sounds like is, we really want Israel to stop talking about what it's doing, because talking about it makes it worse, and hurry up and do what it's going to do and get to the next stage, so we can be the good guys helping in the, saving the day after the fact, right? Please get to the end of the war, but we're not going to stop you in what you're doing along the way, which is just, I mean, it's just gutting. I mean, trying to figure out what that means in terms of humanity and morality and international law in the place of the US. And I don't know what that means for US leadership going forward. I don't know if you want to talk about US leadership. I've already asked your last question, but I saw somebody, so
I mean, I've
Blinken.
already, I think I've said, I've said what I've said. I mean, the US, I wish I could say this in a more organized, organize my thoughts a bit better. The US, I think I'm going to be a bit blunt about this, if I may. I don't think the US cares much if it loses credibility in the Middle East amongst certain populations, I don't think they care about what activists think about them. I think they think the same way these analysts that I mentioned earlier are thinking about. They're thinking about trade, they're thinking about, things that matter to them. And what is happening right now, and this is not my opinion, you can just see the result of the last 3 months. I don't think that they care how this is going to affect the US. I think they think people have short memories. Even when we talk about the elections, and you hear people saying, well, we're not going to vote for Biden, after what he's done and his support. And then you have people bullying them and harassing them online, being like, oh, so you want to be responsible for Trump coming back? Don't put that on them. You can't put that on them. And I think the Biden administration is relying a bit too much on people to say, well, we hate what he's done, but we don't want Trump. I think they're very much underestimating just how repulsed people are about at what they've seen and what that's going to mean for them come election day. And I think they should care more about that. But you get that there's this sense of arrogance, I want to say, right? It's like there's this air of arrogance that nothing will harm us, nothing will touch us, this too bad, but people will forget and we'll go on to the next. People's memories are short. You had this picture of Secretary Blinken standing next to MBS. How long has it been? right? Since Biden said wouldn't even pick up the phone to talk to MBS, the leader of Saudi Arabia. So there's a sense that things will change, and this is not going to be as big of a deal as people say it will. But I quickly, Lara, wanted to just come back to this idea.
I agree with you. I think they're wrong on this. I think people are going to
Yeah,
remember this. I think this is much bigger deal
yeah,
than you think. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah. No, and that's why I'm talking about the arrogance factor, that they don't want to believe it, or they're too arrogant in their sense that this doesn't matter. We're just going to keep going. Some people are going to be upset, but it is going to matter. It really is going to matter. I don't think people are going to get over what we've seen in the last 3 months. But to the point about what could the US do differently, you could also flip that question around and say, well, what could the US at least not do? That's really, it could not bypass Congress to send and expedite assistance to the Israelis while they're doing what they're doing in Gaza, right? I mean, at the very least, don't rush the stuff to them. Do you know what I mean? But there are also ways to delay these arms shipments without making a big deal about it. You don't have to announce it in the press. There's paperwork, there are delays, there are processes. To come full circle to in our discussion about processes in Washington, there are processes that have to be, if Josh Paul is great on this because he's the State Department official that resigned. He talks a lot about the processes that are generally in place when it comes to sending military assistance to countries that we send to. And there are meetings and discussions and checks and balances and all of that stuff. And you could bury shipments in those discussions for months on end, thereby delaying shipments without necessarily saying that you're delaying them, right? But they're doing quite the opposite. They're expediting them. So that's one tangible thing that I can think of, just to answer your question.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I sort of feel like that we're 2 months too late almost for those sort of like 2 months ago, I was saying that someone asked me this question. I said, at the minimum, they need to start articulating and demonstrating a duty of care for Palestinian lives. I feel like January 9th, 2024 is too late for anyone to take that seriously. But that doesn't mean it wouldn't matter. I could be wrong. All right, we could continue on.
Yeah,
It is
I
just
know.
so much fun talking to you about these incredibly depressing things. I so appreciate your insights. Thank you so much, Jasmine, for joining me today. I have to do the official outro. Thank you for joining me today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the website, www.fmep.org, for more content on Palestine and Israel. Make sure you check out, you can subscribe on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Spotify. And you can check out our other podcasts, including the videos on YouTube. I'll also have in the notes to this podcast links to Jasmine's Twitter and longer bio, and she has a website so you can learn more about her amazing work. And I hope to have you back again, Jasmine, if you'll let me.
Thank you so much. I would love that.
All right. And with that, we are going to sign off for this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Thank you very much.